Picture the moment right now, tonight, when a plane leaves Boston for London. The passengers settle in, the seatbelt sign clicks off, dinner service starts, and almost nobody on board has any idea that within a couple of hours, the pilots flying that aircraft will stop talking to the United States entirely. They will check in with a voice in a small town in Canada that most of those passengers could not find on a map, and from that point forward, until they are nearly at the coast of Ireland, every single decision about where that plane goes, how fast it goes, and how close it can fly to the next aircraft belongs to Canada. Not American airspace, not international waters, in the sense most people imagine, some lawless open sky where anyone can fly wherever they want. Canadian-controlled airspace, run by Canadian air traffic controllers under a Canadian system built by Canadians, sitting in a building most of the world has never heard of. That town is called Gander. It sits on the island of Newfoundland, on the easternmost edge of North America, and it controls more transatlantic air traffic than any single location on the planet. Somewhere north of 1,000 flights a night pass through its hands during peak season. Some years, the number pushes toward 500,000 flights in total. Every president, every prime minister, every CEO flying to a meeting in Frankfurt, every soldier being moved to a NATO base, every piece of cargo crossing the pond by air, all of it funnels through a corridor of sky that belongs to Canada. And here's the part that should stop you for a second. The United States cannot get a commercial airliner to Europe without going through that Canadian corridor. Not prefers not to. Cannot. There is no other efficient way to do it. You cannot tariff that. You cannot build a wall around it. You cannot threaten it into submission because it isn't a good or a service sitting in a warehouse somewhere waiting to be taxed. It's the sky itself, and the sky belongs to whoever's underneath it. I'm going to walk you through exactly how this happened, why it happened, and why the same country that holds this much leverage over the most powerful nation on earth has never once used it as a weapon, and on the worst morning in modern American history, used it instead as an act of pure, unscripted kindness that very few people ever talk about anymore. Stick with me, because by the end of this you will never look at a contrail the same way again. Let's start with the basic geography, because this is the part almost nobody gets taught, and it explains everything that follows. If you pull up a normal flat map of the world and you draw a straight line between New York and London, that line looks like it should go almost due east, slicing straight across the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That's what your brain expects. Straight line, shortest distance, simple. Except the Earth isn't flat. It's a sphere. And on a sphere, the shortest distance between 2 points isn't a straight line on a flat projection, it's something called a great circle route. And great circle routes do something that feels deeply counterintuitive the first time you actually see it on a globe. To get from the east coast of the United States to almost anywhere in Western Europe, the shortest path doesn't go straight across the ocean. It curves. It bows upward, northward, climbing toward the Arctic before it ever starts heading toward Europe. So a flight leaving New York for London doesn't slice across open Atlantic water in a clean diagonal. It climbs up over New England, crosses into Canadian airspace almost immediately, threads over Nova Scotia, over Newfoundland, and only then does it head out over open ocean toward Ireland and the UK. A flight from Chicago to Rome does something similar. So does one from Boston to Paris, from Washington to Frankfurt, from Atlanta to Madrid. The exact paths differ slightly, but they all share the same signature. A northward curve that takes them directly over or alongside Canadian territory before they ever reach open water. This isn't a choice airlines make to save money, although it does save money. It's not a regulation some bureaucrat invented. It is the actual physical geometry of the planet. You cannot negotiate your way around the curvature of the Earth. A president can renegotiate a trade deal. He can rip up a tariff schedule. He cannot rip up geography. Every flight planner at every airline every single day draws the same lines on the same charts because physics has already decided where those lines go, and physics put Canada directly underneath them. Now layer onto that the second piece of the puzzle, range. Back in the earliest days of transatlantic aviation, airplanes simply could not carry enough fuel to make the crossing in one shot. They needed a place to stop, refuel, and continue. And if you look at a map of the eastern edge of North America, searching for the very last solid ground before 3,000 kilometers of open ocean, there's one obvious answer: Newfoundland. It sticks out into the Atlantic further east than almost anywhere else on the continent, closer to Europe than New York is, closer in some cases than parts of the US East Coast. So in the late 1930s, with war already brewing in Europe, the British and Canadian governments cleared a stretch of boreal forest near a railway stop and built an airfield. They called it Gander, after the nearby river. Almost nobody outside aviation circles had heard the name before, and for a while, almost everybody in aviation knew it intimately. During the Second World War, Gander became the eastern launch point for what's now remembered as the Atlantic Ferry Operation, an enormous, largely forgotten logistical achievement where thousands of bombers and fighters, built in factories across the United States and Canada, were flown to Gander, fueled up, and then sent across the ocean to reinforce Britain. Without that airfield and the skilled crews who ran it, getting that volume of aircraft to the war in Europe would have been brutally slower and more dangerous. After the war ended, commercial aviation exploded, and for a couple of decades, Gander became one of the most important airports on Earth for an entirely different reason. Every transatlantic passenger flight needed to stop there to refuel before continuing on. It didn't matter if you were a head of state, a movie star, or an ordinary family emigrating to a new life. If you were flying across the Atlantic in that era, there was a real chance you passed through Gander's terminal. The town earned itself a nickname that sounds almost absurd today for a place most people can't locate on a map: the crossroads of the world. Then came the jet engine, and almost overnight, that whole role evaporated. New aircraft had the range to fly New York to Paris, or Chicago to London, without stopping anywhere. The refueling stopovers stopped. The crowds in the terminal disappeared. By most measures, Gander should have simply faded into irrelevance, another small town that briefly mattered to the world, and then didn't, except something else happened instead, something far more interesting than simple decline. The planes stopped landing in Gander. They never stopped flying over it. Because remember the geometry. The great circle routes never moved. The curvature of the Earth didn't change just because engines got more efficient. Every flight from eastern North America to Europe still had to pass through that same stretch of sky over Newfoundland and the North Atlantic, whether the plane touched down there or not. So Gander transformed itself from a place planes landed into a place that watched planes fly past, at 35,000 feet, hundreds of them a day, all needing to be tracked, separated, and guided safely through a stretch of ocean that has no radar coverage at all. That last detail matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Over most of the world, air traffic controllers can see planes directly on radar, the same way you'd imagine from movies. A blip on a screen, updating in real time, showing exactly where every aircraft is. Out over the middle of the North Atlantic, there is no radar. It's too far from land for ground-based radar to reach, and for most of aviation history, there were no other reliable systems to fill that gap. Controllers were essentially managing hundreds of aircraft a day in a stretch of sky where they couldn't actually see any of them directly. That should terrify you a little, and it terrified aviation regulators enough that Canada built something to solve it. In 1968, Canada commissioned one of the very first automated oceanic air traffic control systems in the world, right there in Gander, a computer-assisted setup that let controllers track aircraft positions using estimated speed, heading, and reported position updates, maintaining safe separation across an empty stretch of sky with no radar at all. This wasn't a system Canada inherited by accident. It built the technology from scratch to solve a problem nobody else had solved yet, and in doing so, it didn't just hold the gateway to transatlantic air travel, it engineered the gateway. That system has evolved dramatically since, but the core role hasn't changed. Today, the entire operation is run by NAV Canada, a unique organization that doesn't quite fit the mental model most people have of government agency. It's a private, nonprofit corporation, owned by the aviation industry itself, that operates the entirety of Canada's civil air navigation system, including one of the largest and busiest blocks of sky on the planet, and the volume that flows through it is almost impossible to picture. The North Atlantic corridor between North America and Europe is the single busiest stretch of oceanic airspace anywhere in the world. On the heaviest travel days, something on the order of 3,000 flights cross that ocean. During the overnight eastbound rush, when planes leave North America in the evening to land in Europe the next morning, more than 1,000 aircraft can cross in a single overnight wave, a kind of invisible river of humanity flowing east, while most of the continent underneath them sleeps. The western half of that river, the half closest to North America, belongs to Gander's control. In a recent record year, the Gander Flight Information Region handled roughly 500,000 flights. 500,000. And the number of human beings actually doing that work, sitting in front of screens guiding aircraft they cannot see directly, talking pilots across thousands of kilometers of empty ocean, is remarkably small. A few dozen specialized oceanic controllers, doing a job that very few people on Earth are trained to do, managing a volume of traffic that would overwhelm almost any other system on the planet. There's another piece of this that deserves attention, because it shows just how deep this goes. The winds over the North Atlantic, particularly the jet stream, are not constant. They shift, sometimes dramatically, day to day, season to season. A headwind that costs an airline thousands of dollars in extra fuel going one direction can become a tailwind that saves them money going the other direction, if the route is drawn correctly. So every single day, planners, working in coordination between Canadian and British aviation authorities, draw an entirely new set of parallel highways in the sky, officially called the North Atlantic Tracks. These aren't fixed roads. They're redrawn daily, sometimes several times a day, shifting north or south depending on where the jet stream happens to be sitting that day, designed to let eastbound flights ride the tailwind and westbound flights dodge the headwind as much as possible. Airlines submit their preferred routes. Canadian and British controllers, working together, finalize the actual tracks that get published and flown. Every airline crossing the Atlantic that day flies one of those tracks. The people holding the pen on the western half of that decision, every single day, work for Canada. Now stretch this picture out a little further, because it goes beyond just the flights themselves. The eastern half of this same operation, the control center on the other side of the ocean called Shanwick, covering the airspace closer to Ireland and the UK, runs on a system called GATS Plus, a piece of oceanic air traffic technology that was designed and built in Canada. So even the technology underpinning the British half of this operation has Canadian engineering inside it. And then there's the detail that genuinely surprises people the first time they hear it. The global body that writes the actual rules for civil aviation everywhere on Earth, the organization that decides international standards for everything from pilot licensing to airspace classification to safety protocols, a United Nations specialized agency called the International Civil Aviation Organization, is headquartered not in Washington, not in Geneva, not in London, but in Montreal. So let's say the obvious thing plainly, because it deserves to be said without softening it. The United States cannot reach Europe by commercial air travel at any meaningful scale without passing through Canadian-controlled airspace. Every flight from the eastern half of the country to anywhere on the European continent either crosses Canadian domestic airspace, Canadian oceanic airspace, or both. There is no efficient alternative routing that avoids it. American passenger aviation, American air cargo, American business travel, American military transport heading to NATO commitments, virtually all of it flows through a gate that Canada operates, and for that privilege, airlines pay NAV Canada a service charge for each crossing, a fee structured to cover the cost of running the system rather than to generate profit. That gate has operated reliably, professionally, every single hour of every single day for generations. And that reliability is precisely why almost nobody in government, in business, or in the traveling public ever stops to think about it. The systems that work the best are always the systems that disappear from view. You don't think about the ground holding you up until something makes you notice it's there. So let's notice it. Sovereignty over airspace is one of the oldest and most fundamental principles in international law. Every nation controls the air above its territory, all the way up, and granting access to that airspace to another country's aircraft is something extended between nations, not a guaranteed right that exists in nature. Most of the time, that access is so routine, so smoothly negotiated through decades-old international agreements, that it might as well be invisible. But it is not nothing. It is a privilege granted that could in theory be withdrawn, and before anyone dismisses that as some far-fetched hypothetical that would never actually happen, it's worth remembering that closing airspace to a specific country is not some unthinkable, never-been-done scenario. It has been done recently and not quietly. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, country after country, including Canada, the European Union, and the United States, moved within days to close their airspace entirely to Russian aircraft. Russian airliners now have to fly bizarre, looping, fuel-burning detours around enormous stretches of the globe to avoid airspace that used to be a simple, direct path. The skies of the world slammed shut on them in a matter of days, and they have stayed shut ever since. That's the kind of power we're talking about here. Sitting quietly underneath a relationship that most people assume is purely about lumber, cars, and dairy quotas. So picture, just for a moment, a different kind of dispute. Imagine a period of serious trade tension between the United States and Canada, tariffs slapped on steel and aluminum, threats lobbed back and forth, harsh rhetoric about who needs whom more. Now imagine someone in Washington, frustrated and looking for leverage, starts wondering aloud what cards Canada actually holds in a fight like that. The answer, it turns out, has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, written across the sky in contrail patterns 500,000 times a year, and almost nobody bothered to look up. A card doesn't have to be played for it to count. It only has to exist, and to be understood by both sides that it exists. That's true of the locks on a major shipping route, true of a critical mineral that one country happens to control most of the global supply of, true of joint defense infrastructure that both sides depend on equally. And it is true perhaps more than any of those of the sky itself, because unlike almost every other form of leverage, you cannot stockpile an alternative. You cannot build a strategic reserve of alternate flight paths. The geography is fixed. The gate only has one location, and Canada owns it. But here's where this story turns from a lesson about leverage into something far more interesting, and it's the part I actually want you to remember after this video ends. To understand the real character of the country holding this particular card, you don't need a theory about geopolitics. You need one single day. September 11th, 2001. That morning, when the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon unfolded, the United States did something it had never done before in its history. It closed its entire national airspace immediately to every aircraft. Every runway in the country effectively shut its doors at once. And in that exact moment, a problem materialized over the open ocean that very few people fully appreciate the scale of today. Hundreds of commercial airliners that had departed Europe earlier that morning were already deep into their transatlantic crossing well past the point where turning back to their origin was a realistic option, and now they had nowhere in the United States to land. Tens of thousands of passengers were suspended over the Atlantic, heading toward a country that, in that moment, could not receive them, with no idea yet whether the attacks were finished or whether more were coming. Within minutes, those aircraft began streaming toward the only landmass close enough and capable enough to take them, Canada. At points during that crisis, planes were arriving in Canadian airspace at a rate of 1 or 2 every single minute, and Canada had to make a decision, in real time, with almost none of the information anyone would want before making it. Nobody knew yet whether more attacks were planned. Nobody could be certain that one of the incoming aircraft wasn't itself compromised. Every single airplane Canada agreed to accept was, in the rawest possible sense, an unknown risk being deliberately guided toward a Canadian city. One government official later described the decision-making in that window as staring directly at a worst-case scenario with no good options. Canada opened its sky. All of it, the government launched what became known as Operation Yellow Ribbon, clearing domestic airspace and routing the stranded aircraft down onto runways at airports across the country. Over the following hours, more than 200 flights, carrying well over 30,000 passengers and crew, were guided safely onto Canadian soil at airports stretching from coast to coast. Halifax alone took in dozens of wide-body jets. Vancouver took in dozens more. Cities across the country that had no warning and very little preparation time absorbed an enormous, sudden, frightened population almost overnight. And out at the eastern edge of the continent, the old crossroads of the world answered the call one final time. Gander, a town with a population of barely 10,000 people, watched 38 wide-body aircraft descend out of the sky that morning and land, one after another, on runways that had mostly gone quiet decades earlier once the jet age made refueling stops unnecessary. Those 38 aircraft were carrying more than 6,500 passengers and crew. In the space of a single afternoon, the population of that small town very nearly doubled. And what happened next is the part of this story that frankly should be taught far more widely than it is. The people of Gander didn't wait for instructions from a government planning document, because there wasn't one written for a scenario like this. They simply absorbed the strangers landing in their town and, in the most literal sense, took them home. Local schools shut their doors to classes and turned into makeshift dormitories, filled with cots and donated blankets. Church basements and community halls became shelters. Families who had never met a single one of these stranded travelers before that morning began cooking for them, washing their clothes, lending out their own cars and house keys, walking nervous, grieving strangers through the surrounding woods, just to give them something to do besides stare at a television, replaying the same horrifying footage on a loop. Local pharmacists filled prescriptions for free, for passengers who had left home with nothing but a carry-on bag. Bus drivers who were at that exact moment, in the middle of a labor strike against their own employer, walked off their own picket line to drive the stranded passengers wherever they needed to go. For 5 days, while the rest of North America's airspace remained closed, and the full scope of what had happened in New York and Washington and over Pennsylvania slowly came into focus, the people of Gander simply kept showing up. One resident, describing those days afterward, put it in a way that's stuck with people ever since. Thousands of people dropped by for what was supposed to be a quick layover, and ended up staying for 3 or 4 days, fed and housed by a town that had never met them and never asked for anything in return. Out of those 5 days came friendships that in some cases have now lasted more than 2 decades. Scholarship funds were created. Marriages happened between people who met during that crisis. Reunions have continued for years afterward, with passengers returning to Gander specifically to reconnect with the families who took them in. Eventually, the whole story became the basis for a Broadway musical that carried the name of that small Newfoundland town to audiences around the world and won major theatrical awards in the process. On the single worst morning in modern American history, the gatekeeper of the Atlantic didn't just keep the gate open. It opened its homes. Now, hold that image steady in your mind, because it's the emotional center of everything else in this story, and ask yourself a harder question. What does it actually mean that this is the same country, the same sky, the same quiet, dependable system sitting underneath every transatlantic flight America has ever flown, and that for most of the time since, almost nobody in Washington has thought about it at all? It's worth being completely honest here, the way any serious analysis of this should be, because the full picture is genuinely more interesting than a simple story about a sleeping giant with hidden power. Canada will essentially never close that sky to the United States. Not as leverage in a trade dispute, not as retaliation for a tariff fight, not under almost any circumstance short of an actual military conflict, and there are real structural reasons why. First, it would be an act of self-harm on a massive scale. Canadian airlines depend just as heavily on access to American airspace for their own flights, heading south to Florida, to Mexico, to destinations across the Caribbean and Latin America. The two countries' aviation systems are woven together so tightly that trying to weaponize one side of that relationship would damage both sides almost simultaneously, with no clean way to inflict pain on one country without absorbing serious pain at home. Second, and maybe more importantly, Canada's broader strategic position in any prolonged trade dispute with the United States rests heavily on a single reputational asset, being seen by allies and by markets alike as the stable, predictable, rules-respecting partner, the one who keeps its word even when provoked, even when treated unfairly. Slamming shut the Atlantic corridor to American aviation, even briefly, even as a single dramatic gesture, would torch that reputation instantly and permanently, and the damage to Canada's credibility as a reliable partner would almost certainly outlast whatever short-term political point it scored. Third, the entire international legal framework that allows civil aviation to function smoothly across borders exists specifically so that ordinary commerce, ordinary travel, ordinary human movement can rise above whatever political disputes happen to be flaring up at any given moment. Canada has been one of the most consistent and committed defenders of that framework for decades, which is no small part of why the global rulemaking body for aviation ended up headquartered on Canadian soil in the first place. So yes, the leverage is real. The geography genuinely does put an extraordinary amount of practical control over transatlantic travel in Canadian hands. But the power of that leverage has never come from the threat of using it. It comes entirely from the fact that it exists, that informed people understand it exists, and that the country holding it has, for 80 years, chosen never to use it as a weapon even once. And that, when you really sit with it, might be the single most important lesson buried inside this entire story. Leverage isn't really about what you can take away from somebody else. Real leverage, the kind that actually matters over decades, is about what someone else has trusted you with, consistently, for so long that they eventually stopped even noticing they were trusting you with it at all. The United States has trusted Canada with its front door to an entire continent for the better part of a century, so completely and so consistently that most Americans never even registered there was a door there to begin with, let alone a keeper standing quietly behind it. That trust wasn't handed over in a single negotiation or guaranteed by a single treaty. It was earned hour by hour, flight by flight, year after year, through a system that simply never failed, never wavered, and never once asked for anything beyond a fair service fee to keep the lights on. And on one September morning, when that trust was tested in the most extreme way imaginable, with the entire continent in chaos and nobody able to say for certain what was happening or what might happen next, the answer came back immediately and without hesitation. 38 aircraft, 6,500 frightened strangers, and a town of 10,000 people who simply opened their doors. A country reveals its actual character in exactly the moments when its neighbor is at its most vulnerable. In that specific moment, Canada's character showed up as a fleet of jets parked wingtip to wingtip on a small-town runway, and a community that spent 5 days treating strangers like family, because nobody told them there was any other option. So here's where I want to leave you tonight, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. Every single night, somewhere over the cold, dark water of the North Atlantic, more than 1,000 aircraft quietly hand themselves over to Canadian voices they cannot see, flying through a stretch of sky with no radar, guided purely by trust, training, and a system that has worked flawlessly for more than half a century. Those controllers never mention the leverage sitting in their hands. They never bring up what they could do, if they wanted to every American flight depending on them that night. They just do the job, quietly, professionally, the same way they've done it for generations, because that is genuinely what being a reliable neighbor looks like in practice rather than in theory. It is not a vassal state quietly resenting a more powerful partner. It is not a junior partner waiting for an opportunity to extract concessions. It is a neighbor so consistently dependable that an entire nation stopped noticing the dependability altogether, the same way you stop noticing solid ground underneath your feet the next time you're on a flight from anywhere on the east coast of North America to anywhere in Europe. Take a moment somewhere over the ocean, in the middle of the night, when the cabin lights are dimmed and most of the people around you are asleep, and think about the actual physical fact of where you are. You are inside a stretch of sky that doesn't belong to the country you took off from. It belongs to the country you're flying over, the one most of your fellow passengers will never think about for even a single second of the entire flight. 500,000 flights a year. One small town that became something close to a legend twice over, once for an airfield carved out of the forest, and once for what its people did with no warning and no script on the worst morning anyone on board could remember. And a neighbor that has quietly held open the door to an entire continent for 3 generations, asking for almost nothing in return except the basic decency of being noticed. That's the story sitting above your head every single time you cross that ocean. It's been there the whole time. Most of us simply never looked up long enough to see it.